So do you know what a skinwalker is? Have you ever heard about a skinwalker?
So to me, it kind of like makes me think of like the lizard people kind of thing, but it's just like, an alien essentially, or something that essentially takes on the form of a human being. Probably another, like, if you want to relate it to like media, like I think of I don't know if you watched the Marvel show Secret Invasion. That came.
Happens.
Okay, so it's essentially that. It's the I can't even think of what the name of the people are anymore. But essentially, they have the ability to take on the form of a human being, and it could be anybody. Like it doesn't. It's not just one person. They could take on as many people as they want, and just essentially assume their identity and go about their daily lives as people. So
Very similar to that. So if you've ever heard, a good comparison would be like a Wendigo almost. But if I don't know if you've ever heard of that term before either. It's kind of like, so a Wendigo and a Skinwalker, they find themselves being traced back to Native American cultures. Specifically with a Skinwalker, that's on the Navajo side. But then because of where certain tribes have lived and interacted with each other Native American cultures have also interwoven these traditions. So we're going to dive into a place called Skinwalker Ranch, which I don't believe you're familiar with this place in our lovely country. But I want to kind of start off with by explaining what a Skinwalker is, because it won't make sense to learn about Skinwalker Ranch without first learning what that Skinwalker term means.
yeah,
You can Google it. It's very similar to a Wendigo, though, in the sense that your description was pretty darn close, where a Skinwalker is almost like a witch-like figure. It traces its history back to Navajo legends, and it comes from a Navajo legend where it refers to like a witch-like person that can transform into or possess or disguise themselves as different types of animals. But skinwalkers are very much feared within these Native American cultures. It's not a fun thing, very much a boogeyman-esque. In some of the descriptions that you can read about with, like, how does one become a skinwalker or how does a skinwalker come to be? There was one write-up I was reading a while back when I first went down the rabbit hole with this, where in order to become one, you had to, like, murder someone very close to you, like within your family, and then perform the act of cannibalism and, like, consume them. There's a lot of, like, very weird things that tie into, like, what is a skinwalker, just because so many cultures involved, years have gone by.
right.
Some stuff's written down, some stuff's only anecdotally passed on from, like, generation to generation. But one good description I found that I think has a lot of truth to it is not during the Trail of Tears, per se, whenever the U.S. government was pushing Native American tribes more west and into reservations, but kind of shortly thereafter when tribes started to get pushed really far west, because one thing we'll look at is Skinwalker Ranches in Utah. So you had the Utes. That's where kind of like Utah comes from. You had the Native American tribe of the Utes. They went through a really hard time. So the Navajo, so did honestly all of them. But there was a moment where, because of the transgressions that occurred during that time, the Skinwalker came to be. Now, I'm doing a very poor job describing the intricacies of this cultural phenomenon, basically, but I just want to give you a high-level, like, explanation of a Skinwalker is basically a shape-shifting boogeyman within Native American folklore, similar to a Wendigo. A lot of people have heard of a Wendigo, but maybe not a Skinwalker, which is why I was making that tie in there. Any questions on that before we dive in? Just
So like, so obviously they perform that ritual. They then gain the ability to shapeshift into different animals, or is it just one specific one?
different types of animals. They're known as, like, shapeshifters. One example is people will say that skinwalkers can shapeshift into, like, a dire wolf. And sometimes even animals that may not theoretically be around today, just because skinwalkers could have been around for who knows how long. And so they could shapeshift into animals that maybe you wouldn't even be able to see today because they're extinct, but they were around at a certain point in time. Or maybe they transform into a dog or something scary, something like that. Very
So do you
boogeyman-esque.
do you think that theoretically speaking, then that skinwalkers could be amongst us then as dogs and like to see how normal people live? Like, do you think they could still because I mean, obviously, it's based up in Utah, like in a very secluded area. It's not an area that just I feel like normal people would just go to every single day. So it's like, do you think it's just like just congested there, like it's just in that little area, or do you think it's actually become more widespread now? Like, I feel like that's something that I don't know if you're planning on getting into that at all, but
That's a good question. That's a very good question. So Skinwalker Ranch, just for context, we'll dive in and I'll try to answer that question here. Kind of
you're good.
Yeah, no, because I think a good explanation would be, so Skinwalker Ranch, for context, I can pull up Google Earth here and give a visual, but it's in northeastern Utah. It's in what's called the Uinta Basin. So it's in a basin, a geographic formation. The ranch itself sits on 512 acres. So this is a large plot of land here. The reason I bring up this to kind of answer your question is this plot of land is in what's called the path of the Skinwalker, which is where the Utes and the Navajo believe that the Skinwalkers actually walk amongst within that land. It's a very much of a no-go zone for a lot of those cultures and populations because they believe it inhabits that area. Now, good question as to, do they explore beyond that area? My own opinion, possibly yes. But what do I know? The one thing that's interesting is there have been sightings, proposed sightings within Texas even, which is where you and I are located, of skinwalkers and wendigos and things like that. Now, I don't know what's fact and what's fiction and what's hyperbole, but there are reported sightings of these things outside of, the 512 acres that make up Skinwalker Ranch. So maybe. But I think based on what we'll kind of dive into here, I think northeastern Utah, through various anomalies and paranormal events, seems as though it's kind of a central hub for some reason. That reason, I don't know, but we can dive into it. So let me, just to give you a visual of where this is at, because I want everyone to know, especially those that are watching. And if you're an audio only land, that's totally cool. I'll describe it as to what we're showing on screen. But if you're an audio only land, definitely recommend checking us out. We're on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify for video as well too, if that interests you, but got a couple options out there. So pull up Google Earth here. We're actually going to zoom in here on Utah, and just to keep it easy, let me bring up Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, and we'll zoom in here. I kind of want to do the fancy zoom just for the sake of it. So let me zoom out here just to give you context of like, where exactly are we looking here? So you can see the outline of Utah here. It's almost a rectangle, but it's got the little northeastern chunk taken out. So it's got a panhandle up here in the northwest, but we're kind of looking in the northeastern section here in what's called the Uinta Basin. And this is a basin right here. And we can see it's not a heavily populated area. It's pretty kind of like out there. But this is where the ranch itself is located. But you can see, so I said it's 512 acres. So it's a pretty large plot of land going on here. But you can also see here there's like other landmarks, such as like the Sacred Stone Circle of the Navajo Ute. So there's a lot of heavy Native American populations in this area. Obviously, they were kind of the first ones here in the sense of before a lot of, whatever you want to call it, manifest destiny, Europeans and Americans kind of moving out west. You can also see there was a lot of lore in the area already because you can see the UFO Valley Campground and UTV tours are out here. But Skinwalker Ranch, northeastern Utah. Let me dive into a little bit of the background to give you an understanding of where a lot of this lore came from. So there's been a lot of paranormal associations with this part of Utah, regardless of the ranch and this property we're going to dive into. So there's always been the folklore behind skinwalkers because of the Native American tribes in the area. But besides that, there's been a lot of extraterrestrial things in the sky, a lot of paranormal activity type sightings. UFOs have always been heavily cited there all throughout the early and late and middle 20th century. But where a lot of this kicks off with is actually in the 1990s, whenever the Sherman family purchased the property that will become known as Skinwalker Ranch. Even before the Shermans had purchased this property, people were relatively spooked by the area. I kind of mentioned earlier how some of the tribes in the area, they don't like to play around in this land. It's a no-go zone. You kind of go around it, very boogeyman-esque. But there is a private property here that was owned by a family almost throughout the entire 20th century, up until the 90s when it was sold to the Sherman family. Now, Sherman family purchased this property in 1994. The reason they purchased this was they were actually attracted by the size of the property, 512 acres. That's a huge plot of land. It's a good deal.
Right.
And the reason why, they wanted to raise cattle. They wanted to basically have a cattle ranch. And they also wanted a kind of remote location to raise their family. So it was a husband and a wife. And at the time, they had a boy and a girl. If I remember correctly, I didn't write this in my notes. I believe the boy was like 10 and the girl was a teenager. May have been reverse of that. Anyways, young kids, burgeoning family, wanted to have the American dream, wanted to have a good old cattle ranch. Here's where it got really interesting for them, even before purchasing the property. The ranch had, before the Shermans, been owned by a family called the Myers. It's M-Y-E-R, the Meyer family. They had owned that property for 4 decades prior to the Shermans. However, the Myers didn't live on the property. They actually were living in Salt Lake City, so they really weren't even on the property on a daily basis. They'd only check the homestead every once in a while just to make sure, you want to check on your property, make sure no one's squatting on there, keep up with the grass, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when the Sherman family approached the Myers about purchasing the property, the Myers actually had a very strange setup. They had deadbolts on all of the property doors and buildings, so everything was like heavily locked down. They kind of noticed this during the point of sale. And also the owners, before they sold to the Shermans, had mentioned they're not allowed to dig on the property. They prohibited the Shermans from digging on the property. At least that's what they told them during the sale of the property. So Shermans buy the property, they move on to it, and this is where things start to get a little spooky. Before I get into the spooky parts, any initial questions, anything I can help clarify about where this is, what this is? What are you thinking?
I mean, I can already just see, obviously, by looking at the piece of land. I mean, some of the stuff that sticks out to me most, though, is all the circular pieces that are kind of carved out in the areas. Because, I mean, when you think of extraterrestrial stuff, things like that, I mean, you immediately think crop circles. But, I mean, obviously, you have a lot of desert out there as well. But what kind of throws me off, though, is the areas that people aren't allowed to go to. Because when you have stuff like this, I mean, usually the main area of what it's called isn't where the true beginning of what happened is actually at. That's just kind of where they just, set up shop at. As far as the not being able to dig on the property, I mean, that could be an actual, law. Because, I mean, in the state of Texas, I mean, you have what's called mineral rights. So if you don't own those mineral rights, then you can't dig past a certain distance past the ground level. So I mean, that could be the case of that too. But the fact that they were just immediately hey, yo, can't do this, don't do this. There's just a lot of different stuff that really sets stuff in motion as far as how this is actually going to go. I can see how this is going to go already.
Nice. Okay. I took off the screen share just to make this really intimate and spooky here as I start to explain what went down on this property. So Sherman's bought the property, 1994. Family of 4, good, God-fearing American family moves in. Well, as soon as they move in, they begin to start experiencing very unusual phenomena, including strange noises, unexplained lights, and sightings of large, unidentified animals on the property. So there's a lot of like poltergeist activity that starts to occur, a lot of anomalies in the air. They start to hear voices. So a few things that kind of happened to set up their experience. So unusual animal encounters. So one of the most notable things that they experienced almost immediately after moving on to the property was this wolf-like creature that they noticed running across the property, and it was larger than a normal wolf. Like, these are cattle ranchers, so they're very familiar with, typical wildlife that you would see running across your property. Like, I don't, at least for my own, life, I don't see wolves on the regular. I see coyotes, but I would hopefully understand when I see something larger than I typically would have, like, oh, hey, this is not normal to my terrain, at least. So they saw this like larger wolf than what they had expected. And since they had cattle on the property, you got to protect your cattle, especially when you're cattle ranchers. Like, that literally is your livelihood. So naturally, exactly, that is your money. That's your income. You don't want anything to ruin that, especially a large wolf walking on your property. So naturally, they attempted to shoot it. But even after shooting it multiple times, the wolf didn't die, nor did it seem to ever be harmed. And it eventually just left the area. So they had this wolf come on the property, started attacking their cattle. In particular, it attacked a calf. They tried to shoot it. They did technically shoot it. It appeared to be unharmed and just kind of strolled away. But this was like a larger than average wolf. In addition to that, they started to see UFOs in the sky. The family reported seeing mysterious aircraft and these weird lights and anomalies in the sky, some of which they had described as large, silent, and exhibiting like unconventional flight patterns. Now, one thing I will mention, they're in Utah. They have very clear night skies. For those listening, like, if you live in an urban environment and you've never really gotten outside of the city limits before, you can see a full night sky. Like, when you're in a city and you look up, you really don't see too much. Like, yeah, you see stars, you see the moon, stuff like that. But when you get out there, especially when you're used to living out in a rural area, like, you know what the sky looks like. Especially when you're ranching. You're outside a lot. You really get familiar with what the sky looks like. But they start to see these large anomalies, fast-moving lights in the sky. They can't explain it. In addition to that, so they see weird animals, large wolves, apparently bulletproof, start to see UFOs, weird lights in the skies, etc. Then they start to have poltergeist activity. So inside their home, the Sherman family started to encounter like this poltergeist scenario phenomena that happened. They started to have objects being moved around inside their home without them being involved in the moving of those items. They started to hear inexplicable sounds and ghostly apparitions. There's examples that they explain, and I'll dive into how we know all this in a little bit. But the Sherman family had this instance where the wife, which the name escapes me, she is like putting up the dishes, and so she has like stacks of dishes, and she's putting them in the cabinets, and then she turns away and turns back, and all the dishes are right back out of the cabinet, like where she initially started off with them. Just within the matter of seconds. Didn't hear anything. It just, boom, happened. There's also an example where Papa Sherman, he's like out in the ranch, and things are being moved around on the field. Like, hundreds of pounds worth of equipment is being moved around without like anyone's involvement in the matter of seconds. It's very weird and very spooky, especially knowing that they're out in the middle of nowhere. And for someone to be moving large machinery, they would have to, like, you would hear it, right? Or you would, if they're towing it, you would hear a vehicle coming out there to tow it. Everything I just said is just the beginning of what they experienced. That's just like level one of a couple of levels we're about to dive into here. But what are your initial thoughts?
So, kind of just like hearing all of that. So I have a few opinions about a couple things as far as that. So I've never been like one to shy away from like, ghost figures, things like that, because some spirits are more friendly than others. You know, like I'm not saying like I would just straight up go into a haunted place, but I've had a couple of encounters myself, or what have appeared to be those type of encounters, is dealing with like, you know, spiritual aspects and ghost figures and things like that. Now, I'm going to kind of ask a question, but then I'm going to talk, and if you want to answer the question afterwards, if you can, that's fine. Did all this happen in like that order, or did everything just start happening as soon as they took possession of the home?
Both. So
okay.
There's a really good documentary and a book. The book came out first, called The Hunt for the Skinwalker. There's also a documentary of the same title based on that, with George Knapp, who is a journalist, and then you have Jeremy Corbell. Those two individuals, conveniently enough, if you remember our UFO and alien episode, there was a photo I showed you of those three men that were being sworn in under Congress. The people sitting behind them, that was Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp. So they're both heavily investigated this. And George Knapp, back in the 90s, interviewed the Sherman family and some of the other individuals we'll dive into here in a little bit. And I remember from those conversations, those interviews specifically, the wolf incident happened almost immediately after moving onto the property. And then the poltergeists and the UFO sightings, or the lights, started to happen very shortly thereafter.
Okay. The reason why I asked that question is because, first off, and then just this, I'm going to take kind of like a small left turn here for a second. But in the state of Texas, when it comes to selling real estate, if you know it as a seller, if you know something about the property, you have to disclose that. And I know there's certain things that you can't disclose, but like I'm pretty sure ghost things fall within that category of things that you have to disclose. Like I'm trying to remember back from when I took my classes, but I'm pretty sure you have to disclose that stuff if it's like haunted or if there's anything of that there. The fact that the sellers did not do that, they probably don't care. They're probably nowhere near to be found now, but that was a lawsuit waiting to happen. But in my opinion, if I'm a cattle rancher and there's wolves on my property and I shoot that wolf with, you know, if I have a hunting rifle that's either, you know, 308, 300 blackout, 30-06, if I'm shooting this wolf multiple times and nothing is happening to it and it just wanders off like nothing, I'm immediately getting my family and I'm moving out of there. There's some stuff going on there. I'm not staying there. Like, there's a limit to how much I would take in those certain scenarios, as far as like, okay, cool, like a wolf, that's kind of weird. Within the moment I start hearing, you know, stuff going on around my property, everything like that, I'm like, you know what, we're out. We're going to find these sellers and we're getting this property, like we're getting our money back, like one way or another. But yeah, it's interesting how that just unfolded like that. It seems like, now, do you think any of this stuff, and you might actually answer this question here in a bit, but do you think any of this stuff would have actually have happened if they would have just, you know, moved in, left well enough alone, and just kind of just went about their business? Like, do you think any of this stuff would have taken place?
A good question. It's a very good question. And one thing I was looking up was, I remember seeing in the documentary, they talked about what type of rifle they use, and it was a large rifle. I was trying to Google it just right quick, but I wasn't able to find it as quick as I would hoped. If you want to Google it on your side, feel free to, but it was a large caliber rifle, which is why they were so shocked that it didn't down the wolf. To answer your question though, I think there's some legitimacy as to the spookiness of this property, because at least from my interpretation, the Meyer family, the original owners of it, remember, they didn't live on this property. They were living in Salt Lake City. They just checked up on it a couple times, and they told the Shermans to not dig on the property. And that makes me think they were aware that something was there. Now, the land has kind of had this lore around it because it's in the path of the Skinwalker. But how much did the Meyers know, or how much did the Meyers experience? That's a good question. I haven't done too much research into what the Meyers, at least on the record, knew, or at least said they knew or did not know. A lot of the research I've seen and just that's done on it has been from the Sherman family up to present day, because the ranch has since had multiple owners since then as well, some of which are government affiliated, which is where this will get interesting.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, well, honestly, I mean, the moment you mentioned UFO sightings, I mean, that kind of doesn't surprise me, because, I mean, there's already places in our country alone that have been known for UFO sightings and stuff like that. But for it to be a paranormal type events occurring, and then for the government to be like, "Hey, we're gonna explore this," something obviously was happening there, and it probably predates even the time that that these people took ownership of the property, especially if there were certain areas where they were like, "Hey, you can't go to this specific area on this property." Like, something hasn't been going on there.
Yeah. Now, one of the more spooky things that happened to the Sherman family on this property was cattle mutilations and some of the cattle just outright disappearing. So cattle mutilation is not unique of a phenomenon to Skinwalker Ranch. It happens kind of all over the globe. A lot of it happens actually in like South America as well, and a lot of the northwestern US, but it happened a lot on Skinwalker Ranch. What I mean by cattle mutilations is they had a few scenarios where they would come across a dead cow on the ranch, but there would be surgical like incisions in the cattle, and it was entirely drained of blood. So there's no blood on the scene, no blood in the animal, nor on it, but there would be a surgical incision, and that's where we're assuming the blood came out of. There's also, on the animals themselves, no signs of struggle. Now, we'll dig into like some of the research that's been done here, but they've had experts look at this, like bovine experts, like experts that know what they're talking about much more than I ever will. And they can confirm that there's no signs of struggle on these animals. There's no blood on the scene, nor on the animal. And it's drained of blood, and there's no sign of struggle. Like, it's a very weird thing. But this has happened elsewhere, too. It's not unique to this ranch, but...
Do you think that the animals were... So, I think I've heard this somewhere, that Wendigos possess the ability to hypnotize their prey. And
that sounds correct. I'm not going to debate that.
Anyone out there who's listening, feel free to research this for yourself. Again, we just try to improvise and kind of go with what we got, but
we're having a good time.
Exactly, but I'm pretty sure, I'm 80% sure. I'm gonna actually stick with 80%, but that Wendigos have the ability to, per their existence, have the ability to hypnotize their prey, which would kind of explain the no sign of struggle, because if they hypnotize the cows and then they were just like, "Hey, we're going to freeze you in your tracks," kind of thing, you're going to be stuck there, and then they take the time to drain it of its blood, and then ergo the no sign of struggle. To me, that's the only thing that could really classify that being the case, because you're not going to, unless you shoot a cow in the head, you're not going to have you're going to see struggles, from a cow being mutilated and killed. And this is just coming from my experience of being on farms, meat processing plants, things like that. You're going to have that kind of stuff happening. So it's to me, that I feel like that for some reason, I don't know why, but that makes sense to me. I don't know why. So.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So the Sherman family, so far, they've experienced these weird cattle mutilations. They've heard voices. Things have moved around on the property without their influence. They're seeing these weird lights and aerial phenomena. A lot of spooky things that are going on here. And so naturally, oh, did you find something?
I did. And I was actually partially right, but Wendigos, let me actually find it real quick, where it said, let's see here. Trying to look to see. Okay. Surprisingly strong and agile. It's able to mimic voices familiar to its victims.
Yes.
And let's see here. I'm trying to actually. Okay, yeah. So, the Wendigo possesses the ability to freeze its prey. It does this by simultaneously staring straight into its victim's eyes and emitting a droning sound, which causes them to quite literally become paralyzed with fear. Only by screeching can the Wendigo undo the stare's effects. So I was pretty much right. They hypnotize it and just completely cause it to stop in its tracks.
Yeah.
There we go. Fact check correct. We're good here, everyone.
Exactly. We're on to something here. So yeah, so all this like stuff's going on. Naturally, I would be terrified. Like I would be curious, but I would be terrified if I'm like seeing this stuff, especially the poltergeist things. You're hearing voices, you're hearing things creep around the property, things are moving, very spooky. So naturally, they're kind of concerned and they start to basically try to just reach out for just any help. Because remember, they bought a 512-acre ranch. They're good, just average Americans where they can't just like up and leave. Like they're kind of locked into this property the same way a lot of people that buy a home and they can't just casually, sell it and assume everything's going to be okay. Like they're financially locked into this property at the point. So they start reaching out for help, trying to figure out like, what can we do? And so they ended up actually getting in contact with something, an organization called NIDS, NIDS. And that stands for the National Institute for Discovery Science. And it was headed by an individual named Robert Bigelow. You can actually look into Robert Bigelow, very interesting guy. He claimed to fame initially. He owned Budget Suites, such a chain of motels, made a lot of money. If I'm correct, he is a billionaire, multiple billionaire. But he ended up founding this organization called NIDS. And basically with NIDS, they go in and they're able to search for anomalies. They're like an organization that if something sounds a little weird, they'll go in there, give it like a legitimate scientific study and see if they can find out what the causation of that is. Now, at the time, NIDS was made up of a lot of legitimate scientists, so much so that a lot of them never disclosed what their names were. Some of them have. Some of them are on record saying, yes, I was part of NIDS. Yes, this is who I am. Very interesting. One of them is, at least as of a couple of years ago, is still a professor, at least up the road for me, down the road for you at Baylor. They're still like a professor of physics, I believe. But a lot of them are off the record because they are individuals that do not want their professional careers impacted by their involvement with an organization like NIDS, looking into UFOs, poltergeist, paranormal phenomena, things like that. But they do have a legitimate curiosity of trying to explore and explain these things through traditional science, if that makes sense. Yeah. But Robert Bigelow was basically the funder of this organization. And because with NIDS coming in and Robert Bigelow's involvement, the media apparatus started to kind of notice what's going on here, just because there's a lot of money and a lot of fascination flowing in because the story is starting to be told at this point in time. And so naturally the family, while all this is going on, they're still stressed. Robert Bigelow says like, hey, let me just buy the property from you and I'll have my team basically live on the property. So after they interview, kind of get everything on the record from the Sherman family, they believe them at this point based on what the NIDS team is starting to see. Robert Bigelow comes in, they purchase the property, so the Shermans slowly kind of exit from the situation. I kind of fast forwarded through a lot of what the NIDS team did, but basically before they sold the property, they came on, interviewed everybody, tried to make sure like this situation is legitimate before Robert Bigelow said like, hey, I'm gonna buy the property from you. Let's set up base here. Let's start observing and reporting, for lack of a better term. So, and then from there, once NIDS moves on to the property, that occurred in 1996. So Sherman family bought it in 94. They had to put up with this demonic hell on earth situation all the way until 1996. So this wasn't like a short period of time. It was like multiple years of them having to put up with whatever that
like an eternity if you had to deal with that on a nightly basis. Like, I mean, during the day you might not experience a lot because usually paranormal activity is less active during the day. It's usually more active at nighttime. So I mean, like, can you imagine just like, you're like, all right, I want to sleep during the day and I'm just going to stay awake during the night so that I can do stuff at night because I'm not dealing with this. And I'm good.
Exactly. So Robert Bigelow and the National Institute for Discovery Science, they purchased the property in 96. Just for context, NIDS, they study paranormal phenomena, especially at this ranch, but other places too. They like to look at UFO sightings, cryptid sightings, and just really any kind of unexplained phenomena you can think of. Now, NIDS is made up of a host of various different disciplines. You have physicists, biologists, psychologists, people that study geology. So it's a very well-rounded group of professionals, for lack of a better term. And what they do is when they move onto the property, they make it just like the ultimate base. They put up all of the observational things you would expect: security cameras, infrared, trip wires, everything that you think like a scientific discovery team would need in order to really observe this property on a 24/7 basis and capture any and all data you can think of. One thing that I thought was really interesting that they even went to in length was they had teams of dogs live on the property, because they were cognizant enough to say, hey, even though we have all this technology, human-made technology on the property, there's still scenarios where dogs may respond to something occurring before our technology would ever pick up on it.
Yeah. And that's a lot of most domesticated or just really any animal, because where our instincts, I mean, as human beings, like, yeah, we have good instincts, but when you have an animal that's trained for that type of stuff, like, they're going to immediately like that pick up on whatever. If there's something that's out there, a dog would pick up on it first before any of your infrared, before any of your cameras, before anything else would pick it up. A dog would pick that up if it's trained the right way.
Yeah. Now, what's really wild, okay, so it's one thing if the story ended with the Sherman family selling and leaving, right? Like, it's one thing you hear these stories about homeowners, house is haunted, they move out. Okay, maybe the house is still haunted, but you don't really hear any like legitimate evidence of this, right? However, with this, when the NIDS team moves onto the property, stuff just continues to happen. Like, it doesn't stop. And they're recording all of it. And it's really interesting because even though they set up all this surveillance, they have the dogs on the property, there's still unexplained cattle deaths happening on the property. They're still seeing UFOs and weird lights in the sky. They're still having poltergeist-esque activity occurring that they cannot explain, but they are able to record some of it. And what's really interesting is if you read or watch The Hunt for the Skinwalker, they interview some of the NIDS scientists. And one of them is on record saying one night when he was out on the property, you would see, let me backtrack here. One thing that a lot of people claim to experience that is UFO adjacent are these orbs that they see floating around the sky. There's multiple instances of these all over, not only our country, but all over the world, of like these glowing orbs that just kind of float around and they follow people. Well, they see these on the property from time to time. And one of the NID scientists one night on record says he saw an orb come out of the ground and appear. And then he saw something crawl out of it and run away and up into a tree. And he saw it through a scope of a rifle, like an infrared scope, basically. Mm-hmm. And he swears he saw this thing, and it's on record. And they have so many other things where they're on record, where the cow mutilations continue, where there's no blood on the site. The scientists are there. Remember, they have all this. Basically, every corner of that ranch is under camera surveillance. And they cannot explain how these cows are dying with these surgical cuts in them, and the blood is being drained and is nowhere to be found. Now, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, someone's killing the cow off the property, bring it in maybe on like a helicopter. Like, let's get wild with it. Someone's bringing a cargo helicopter, bringing the cow in, dropping it, flying away. But they have this whole thing under surveillance, and there's no evidence that that's happening. What else was I going to say? Oh, the other interesting thing that they're observing is, so while yes, they have virtually the entire ranch under surveillance, one thing that the NIDS team is on record saying is they believe that whatever is doing all of this, whether it be one thing, multiple things, whatever that is, knows that it's being watched, because it's very clever about when and how things happen, to where maybe it happens just off where a camera could be located. And so they move the camera, and then it happens just on the other corner again. Or maybe it's a day when they're taking the dogs for like a walk, and then it happens like during that point in time. Like, it's very weird how whenever things happen, it's almost as though it knows to strike when the opportunity's hot, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, to me, the part that throws me off, though, is the the orb coming out of the ground, and then something coming out of that orb,
Yes.
which to me makes it seem like it's just something that's coming from an entirely different dimension at that point. And the fact that this dimension exists, which I'm not saying like other dimensions don't exist. I mean, like there's got to be a form of like, this kind of goes back to like our, I think it was like our first or second episode talking about the solar system and just like actually like other life on other planets. There's probably like other dimensions out there, because you can't tell me that out of any type of reality, like we're not the only galaxy out there, but maybe other galaxies don't have the same dimensions that we have or that we've come to know and understand. So where their dimensions might be, they may have inadvertently found a way to get to our dimension, which i.e. being into our galaxy onto our planet. That actually really kind of trips me up, because I mean, if it happens there, but that also too could just be a very sacred ground as well. I mean, with it being the Indian tribe that was up there, I mean, they're to my experience of talking with Native Americans and just kind of hearing some other stories about stuff that's happened. I mean, they're very cultural people. They're very spiritual people, and they believe in this stuff. Like these are things that they wholeheartedly believe in, along with many other things. But don't get me wrong, you have your modern medicine, but they believe in a lot of the all natural healings and just the spiritual healings and things like that. But for this to be happening in areas like that makes me think that someone back then did something that inadvertently opened that realm, opened up that, inadvertent can of realm worms and decided to just release whatever was there. But the thing is, though, are they there all the time, or do they go back and then come out whenever it's time? Because if they were always just coming through, then we would have them around like all the time. And granted, I mean, they're a very agile creature, but someone would have come across, like, there'd be more people out there being like, this is what this is, like there's no way that this is not. So
no, yeah, you're spot on with that. And one thing I think is really interesting is this part of Utah, or this part of the country, has always had a little higher than average of like unexplained phenomena sightings, whether that be UFOs, whatever you want to call a skinwalker, the orbs, things like that. One thing that's really interesting in the documentary is they go and interview people like within the 21st century, and that part of Utah always has had an increased percentage of like UFO sightings. Now, some of that's probably not real, some of it may be real, who knows? But it is interesting to think that like there could be geologically part of this continent or part of this world that has a higher sighting because of, like, going back to the orbs, the ability to open a gateway, whatever that is. Like, I don't know what that is. It fascinates me so much, but whatever that is, because it happens a lot on this property. And man, I would play a clip if it wasn't like at risk of like getting a copyright strike on like our upload. But I cannot emphasize enough, like, if you're listening, go find that documentary, hunt for the Skinwalker, and it's maybe like halfway through it, they have one of the NID scientists like on record talking about his experience, and he swears he saw something, like an orb. He saw, just to hear someone that is like an accredited university professor scientist say they saw something crawl out of an orb and run away, hide up a tree. Like, what the hell is that? Like, I don't even know how to like grapple with that. But anyways, fast forward a little bit. NIDS has been on the property for a while. They're doing their research, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, their time does have to come to an end, because remember, they are like a privately funded organization funded by Robert Bigelow. So in the early 2000s, NIDS was disbanded. Officially, on the record, it was because of the lack of conclusive evidence of what's happening on the property, but also the high cost of just maintaining an operation like this. Because not only do they have the property, they're paying property tax on it, they're paying all the individuals working on the property, the technology behind that property. Like, once you get a decade plus into this, like, it gets expensive. And so they technically published multiple research papers on this, so they do have a lot of evidence. It is inconclusive, though, just because it's never consistent. It does happen. There's no explanation for why it's happening, but they do know something anomalous is in this area, basically. So they disband. Kind of a legendary thing in terms of like NIDS being on that property, but that's not where it stops. So once NIDS gets disbanded, Robert Bigelow starts what is called Bigelow Aerospace. And through Bigelow Aerospace, that allows Robert to invest and partner with government entities on projects related to space, aircraft, and UFOs. So, because of Robert Bigelow's work and his team's findings at Skinwalker Ranch through the NIDS project, then establishing Bigelow Aerospace, he's now partnering with what was called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which was started by Senate leader Harry Reid, who has since gone on to pass. If anyone knows anything about Harry Reid, very influential member of the U.S. Senate for a long time, but he also had a very healthy interest in all things UFO, UAP. So they start what's called ATIP. It's AATIP, stands for Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And because of Bigelow's involvement with NIDS, then forming Bigelow Aerospace, he's able to kind of work with ATIP to go back to the property, but this time it's a government institution going to the property to do their own investigation. Now, in between the NIDS team and between ATIP, a lot of people are starting to become fascinated and aware that this property and these scenarios have happened and that all this exists. So that's when the book Hunt for the Skinwalker, that gets written in 2005. A gentleman, Colm Keller and George Knapp, they published the book detailing the ranch's history and the findings of the NIDS team. Highly recommend that book if you haven't read it, or even just have it on the bookshelf. You never know. And then you had the documentary Hunt for the Skinwalker based on that Jeremy Corbell did with George Knapp. So those are the books and the documentaries I was kind of referencing earlier. But with ATIP. So ATIP was formed in 2007 at the request of Senator Harry Reid, and it was tasked with trying to find and study and investigate any kind of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, UFOs, et cetera, but from the perspective of a government entity. So this is not a private organization. This is the government, the U.S. government. Yeah. Well, they're interested in Skinwalker Ranch because of Robert Bigelow, everything I was kind of saying earlier. So they basically move back onto the property, kind of inheriting some of what the NIDS team left behind, kind of picking up the baton, picking up the torch, moving ahead. Well, they start to experience some of this stuff as well. So it's still going on, if not increasing. They start to experience a lot of this phenomena as well, the cattle mutilations, the poltergeist activity, etc. But a lot of their findings remain classified. So a lot of their stuff that they recorded from the property, we do know it exists, but it is technically classified. But here's where it gets very interesting. Some of the information and documents that ATIP has been declassified and officially released in 2017. But what got released in 2017 was the UFO encounters that we talked about in the UFO episode with the U.S. Navy, the Tic Tac UFO videos and all that. Yeah. That's from the ATIP program. So those people, or that government entity that was studying those aerial phenomena, is the same one that still has classified documents from their study and time at Skinwalker Ranch. We don't really know a lot about what they experienced, except for the fact that they were experiencing things there still.
Right.
Eventually, their time came to pass, and the property got sold yet again. It actually got sold to a gentleman named Brandon Fugal, F-U-G-A-L. I've never actually heard his last name said out loud, so I'm not sure how to pronounce it. But he bought the property in 2016. He's actually a Utah-based real estate mogul. He's worth a lot of money. He's an entrepreneur, made his money in real estate basically, based out of Salt Lake City. But he was always fascinated with the property. And so when it came up for sale, he's like, hey, this is my opportunity. Let's continue the operation, basically. So he's like the next generation's Robert Bigelow in terms of the fascination with this property. Him and his organization still own it to this day. He's also been very studious with making sure that there are representatives from multiple different disciplines on the property to be able to observe, study, investigate, etc. with this. Since his ownership of the property, History Channel got involved. They did a whole TV show called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. I watched it. It's a little gimmicky. I don't like it. It feels a little, I don't know, the History Channel, Discovery Channel, they're a little, I don't know, not as legitimate. Yeah, they exaggerate a lot, and they never really, way I rash. Go ahead.
I think it's like those paranormal shows. So my wife watches one on Amazon. I think it's on Amazon Prime. And it's these two guys. It's an Asian guy and a taller white guy. I can't think of the actual name of the show, but they kind of act gimmicky towards it. Like one of the guys, he'll taunt the spirits, like he'll like talk crap to him and everything like that. But one of the other ones, he's like, no, I'm not doing this. Like I'm not being left in here by myself. Like I'm not going through this. But I get what you're coming from, though. Funny enough, just before you continue, they actually have a website called skinwalkerranch.com, and it's actually by the guy, Brandon Fugel. And it talks about that. It has like the episodes of the show or whatever, and then there's even like a specific article that was wrote about him when he purchased the property back in 2016. So
yeah, funny enough, since he purchased the property, Post Malone has been out there at least once. Yeah. But yeah, ever since he's owned the property ever since then. But the TV show, like, it's not bad, I guess. I don't know. But the documentary takes it from a very fact-based point of view because it's done by journalists, and like they'll tell you what they think is opinion, but they'll stick to like, this is what was reported, this is what's in the research papers, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Where's the TV show? They have advertisements in the commercial breaks, and they got to keep you hooked and stuff like that. Plus, if they would have ever found anything significant on the show, you would have heard about it before the show premiered, basically. So ever since then, things continue to happen, but that part of the country, I just know a lot of people never really hear about it outside of maybe the TV show or if they've seen the documentary. I have a list of everything that has happened on it. I didn't want to just sit there and like read off a list in the middle of it, but real quick, just to give you context of like other things that have happened. So there's been consistent reports amongst every team or individual that's been on the property where most people experience similar things. People have claimed they've seen dire wolves on the property, which if anyone knows anything about dire wolves, yeah, they're in Game of Thrones, but also they're extinct. Like they did exist at one point on the continent, but they don't exist anymore. So people have seen large dire wolves on the property. They've seen unidentifiable creatures that they have no idea what it is, but they know it looks mammalian of some kind. Of course, people have seen skinwalkers, like from the actual Navajo Ute legend. Especially a lot of the local tribes have said to have experienced this in and around the property. There's also all this disturbances and manifestations. Numerous instances of poltergeist activity have been reported, including objects moving inexplainably, strange noises, disembodied voices, often occurring without any visible cause. There's always been these like shadowy figures and apparitions. The Sherman family and some of the NIDS team have said to have seen shadowy figures and ghost-like things appearing throughout the ranch, leading to speculation about maybe there's like a dimensional overlap or spiritual manifestations occurring on the property. The portal sightings, like I mentioned, the thing that crawled out of the portal, people have seen these orb-like things floating around the property in the sky, totally unexplained. The one that's weird that I haven't mentioned yet on here is the time anomalies, where some of the researchers on the property have experienced like time distortion or where they've like lost time, where it feels as though it's been 5 minutes, but it's really been 5 hours, or the inverse of that.
Now, I do know, I actually want to kind of touch on a little bit of that. So the stuff that you mentioned about the Wendigos, about the voices, like, funny enough, that's actually a specific trait of a Wendigo. Like, they don't have actual lips, but they can mimic the voices of people. The goal of what a Wendigo is it's a spiritual being that finds a host and it takes over that host. So it doesn't necessarily, and like, I don't know if it actually has like a physical form, but sort of what their physical form is just like a white body that is like skin that's like stretched over a body, essentially. Like, that's kind of what the description is they gave there. But talking about just the different animals, like, and just even that part of the country, I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, you have Montana, you have Utah, you have, I think, is it Wyoming that's up there as well?
Wyoming, Nevada's next door.
Yeah, Nevada. So it's like you have all these different areas that, like, there's not very high population. I think Montana has a total population of 600,000 people.
Something like that, yeah.
And it's probably obviously gone up since the last time I've read about that, but that's not a lot of people when you think about the size of the state, especially when most of it is a national park, but that's still not a lot of people. So it's like, it doesn't surprise me that you have aspects of this stuff happening where there's less population at. Now, my question is, though, is this stuff has been going on since, honestly, probably before the 1960s. It's just like it was probably first dated in the 1960s because that's when some, like, I guess, like, new stuff, more stuff started happening with that. But why have they not just dug it up? Like, at this point, you're already in this far, just, like, demolish the house, like, get the house out of there, like, don't even have it as, like, a ranch anymore, and just take a whole excavation crew in there, take it all out. Take out all the trees, take out everything that there's anywhere possible for anything to hide at, and just dig the ground up. Because, and like when you're talking about like the time distortion and some of, like, it's funny that if you actually consider the movie Poltergeist actually come from a different dimension. It's not like your typical spiritual ghost, but it's actually a ghost that comes from a different dimension. And so that actually kind of goes hand in hand with the Wendigo and what they do and how they operate. But, and like, as far as like the time distortions and things like that stuff, it's weird though that stuff's actually kind of synonymous with that part of the country, because then you have like Nevada, alien sightings, you have Arizona, like places like that.
New Mexico,
but again,
with Roswell.
I was saying New Mexico, but it's, again, at the end of the day, at this point, we have, they're spending billions of dollars on random other stuff. Might as well just go ahead and spend a few $1 million on this just to, like, hey, let's go out here and let's just see what's out there. Because I'm willing to bet money that there is something under that ground, whether it be a temple, not like a large temple, but just something there, or a worship ground. Like, that is a spiritual worship ground, and someone had disturbed something, took something from that area, and the spirits there do not like that, and something is going on there. Like, that's typically what happens when you have poltergeists. It's like that. You're typically disturbing their peace and their slumber. So whoever owned that property before stuff actually started going crazy in the 1960s or even beforehand, screw that person, because they probably just screwed everyone that would ever come near that property ever in their lives.
Might have been. Honestly, it could just be as simple as that. The other thing that's very interesting about what's been experienced here is like electromagnetic and radiation anomalies, which may tie back into who knows like what's in the ground and the fact of like, why haven't we dug this up? So while NIDS was on the property, they noticed that there were these weird fluctuations in the electromagnetic fields and spikes in radiation levels at various like parts of the ranch land, not correlating with any known natural sources or patterns, at least that we are currently aware of. They also noticed that there are weird times throughout their experience on the ranch where some of their electronic equipment, some of the cameras, the recorders, the sensors would occasionally just like not work or warp or just have these weird whoopsie moments, and they wouldn't be able to explain why. It's just totally inconsistent times. So yeah, but I do agree with your question as to like, why not just go out there and just go full force and just see what happens? The only reason I could think that wouldn't happen is when ATIP went out there, if they knew or already were aware of something, maybe they know not to for other specific reasons. If they truly were there to observe and report, to either confirm or deny it was what they were thinking it may be. But I don't know.
Why not just zone it off as like an area that can't like be, like you can't go into that area, like another Area 51 essentially. Like, why not just zone that area off, like put up large fences and then just be done with it? Nobody will go there, nobody will disturb it. Ergo, that means nothing will come out of that ground again, and it could just stay. It could just stay where it's at.
No, that's a valid question. Like, and when you said that, the first thing that came to mind was, well, if they were to do that, I could see that reinforcing the fact that something is there, and then people may be tempted to go there more often that aren't permitted to go there. I just, like the whole Naruto run into Area 51, that whole nonsense.
Right.
On the other side of it, you could have where they do know something's there, potentially. Because the other weird thing is, it is now privately held again. Like, it was sold to a private individual or an organization, at least. And if that would be a better custodian of the property rather than the government, in the sense that normal people would be less likely to even be aware that it exists because of that. Now, everything I just said could be easily disproven just by saying, oh yeah, there's like a History Channel TV show about this. There's a documentary about this. There's a book written about this. But I truly don't know. But that's a valid question of like, if they really did find something, wouldn't they want to just like own it, lock it down? I don't know, keep it away from the public? But
now, the $1 million question. This is not just for us. This is for anyone who's listening, and you can feel free to put your responses in the comments. If you ever had the opportunity, would you go and visit it? Just for like one day. Like, you had to say one day and one night, and then you could leave the very next day. Would you do it?
that is something they actually ask in the documentary is, like, if you, like, would you spend the night there? And most people were saying no. Most of the NIDS team, like, did not spend the night there on the property by choice. I don't want to misremember, but I think it was George Knapp, one of the journalists who co-wrote the book.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was him. I don't want to misspeak, so someone definitely fact check me this afterwards. But I think he remembers saying that he actually did spend one night on the ranch when he was preparing to write the book in like the early 2000s, and maybe it was the late 90s. I think it was the early 2000s, and he remembers being terrified because I think he was sitting in the kitchen of the main ranch property. I may be misremembering that, but I think I remember him saying he spent the night there once, but he was legitimately terrified the whole time. And he's investigated some other things too. He broke the story on Bob Lazar as well, which we can talk about him another time. But like, he's no newbie when it comes to the unknown. So
now,
I would not spend a night there, though. No, I would.
You wouldn't.
I would spend a long day with the sun in the sky there. I would not spend the night there, though.
How much would you have to be paid to spend the night there?
As of recording, I would do it for $10 million.
$10 million?
Yeah, because that would give me enough to invest it in the stock market to not have to work a day in my life ever again.
What if it'd be funny enough if you got a phone call tomorrow and you're like, "Hey, Riley, I'm going to Skinwalker Ranch. I'll see you when I get back, buddy."
I'll do it. I'll film a documentary. I'll take a camcorder with me. I'll film the whole thing. But
here's the thing: I'll see if they just cut me a nice little $5 million, and then I'll be happy with $5 million. I can do anything with that. But no, I mean that's I don't know about anyone else who, obviously for those of you who will listen to this, but I learned a lot about Skinwalker Ranch. I mean, we've talked about it before, about a few things about it, but I've never really dived into it. I can honestly, for one, say that I looked up that the documentary is on Amazon Prime, and I'm pretty sure it's free. It comes with it, so I'm gonna actually check that out because I want to know more about Skinwalker Ranch. And well, my wife likes creepy stuff like that too, so maybe we'll make a date night out of it and we'll just watch a whole documentary on Skinwalker Ranch. It'd be fun. It'd be great. I
had Abby and I watched it once, and I think she enjoyed it.
Well, was it good though? Like, was it actually?
It's very good. I've watched it at least, because I even showed it to my dad once. I think I've seen it at least 4 times. The first time I watched it, I was shook. I was like, how did I not know about this? First of all, I was like, how did I not know this place in our country existed?
Right.
And second, you get to see, okay, so the premise of the documentary, I think it's also on Hulu, because I've always watched it on Hulu, so it may be on there too, but it for sure on Amazon. The cool thing about that documentary is George Knapp, the co-writer of the book, he's also in the documentary. He kind of co-hosts the documentary.
Mm-hmm.
But what the documentary is they go into George Knapp's archives of the original footage of when he went out there. I think it was in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And so they incorporate the original footage with the original interviews with modern day interviews, modern day footage. So you get to see both like the 90s and then like the 2000 or 2019 or whenever it was filmed.
Gotcha.
So you see both sides of the coin there.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm definitely going to check it out. I mean, I didn't expect half of what we talked about. I thought it was just, a beast or something that takes over human bodies. And to be fair, I was right on that, as reading that stuff, I mean, it's essentially a spiritual entity, but something's definitely going on there. Unscripted Company is definitely on the case, and we're going to figure it out, and we're going to bring it to you live one of these days. But we're probably never going to go out there unless they pay us a boatload of money, so that's for sure.
Yes. The other wild thing, I'll leave everyone with this. If you want to go down a rabbit hole adjacent to this, what I was talking about, these cattle mutilations, where these surgical incisions, no blood on the scene, but things drain of blood. We've come across this all over the globe. It is completely unexplainable because it's very consistent. We see it in South America. We see it in North America. We've seen it in Europe. I'm sure we've probably seen it in Asia. We just don't get as much reporting because of just international relations, at least in terms of the way you and I get the news. But it's like a thing, and nobody knows what's doing it. And it's not like it's a copycat because it's so difficult to do. It'd be like you going out there with a surgical device, cutting a perfect hole in this animal, draining it of its blood, and not having a drop of it anywhere on it, around it, while the animal is not struggling. It makes no sense. So I'll leave everybody with that, unless you look like you just went down a rabbit hole maybe by Googling something.
Well, it's funny that you kind of mentioned that, that each culture has its own type of animal or, spiritual type thing that just kind of goes on. And when you mentioned, obviously, kind of mentioning the have you ever heard of the chupacabra?
Yes. That's probably the closest thing to us with Texas and Mexico.
Yeah. So it's kind of the same thing, except obviously they mostly prey on goats because in Mexico, goats are very abundant. They rely on them for a lot of their resources that they have, for in certain areas. And so the chupacabras are the same thing, except theirs isn't a cut. It's it has 3 teeth, and you'll have 3 puncture holes on the neck, and they drain all the blood out of it, and there's no blood left in it. But obviously there's definitely a sign of a struggle but again, this is one of those, it's a myth or supposed myth, but there's also been, again, historically speaking, people have had sightings of it. So just kind of leave that on there as well for people. These things probably do exist. It's just we can't comprehend it because we don't operate on the same dimension as they do. And spirits are real, y'all. I can say that as plain as day, but spirits are real. I don't know if there are people out there that believe in the spiritual aspect of life, but spirits are real, whether they're good or they're bad. They're out there. So,
and with that, it's as always, the company policy. If you made it to this point of the show, give it a like, give it a subscribe, give it a follow, leave a comment. Like Riley mentioned earlier, what would it take for you to spend a night on Skinwalker Ranch? First of all, would you? And if so, how much? What would you do? Would you have fun? Would you dig in the dirt? Who knows?